Hey everyone, welcome back to the Imperial Minis channel. This is Randall, and welcome to part 2 in what will now be a 3-part series on faction identity in the A Song of Ice and Fire tabletop miniatures game. This series is intended for both new and veteran players alike, and will provide a tactics deck focused overview of each faction's identity and playstyle. This should give new players a better idea of which faction or factions align with their desired playstyle, and give experienced players an idea of which factions they might decide to add to their collection. In this video, I'll be covering the Martell, Greyjoy, Targaryen, and Baratheon factions. Hopefully I can keep this video a bit more concise and brief than the last one, but I won't know how that turns out until after I've recorded all the audio. And even if it is too long-winded, there's no way I'm going to redo the whole thing, so here's hoping I can keep things moving. The next and final video in this series will cover the 2 mini-factions so far in the game, House Bolton and the Brotherhood Without Banners. In A Song of Ice and Fire, factions each have a base tactics deck of 2 copies of 7 cards for a total of 14 cards. When you select a commander for your army, that commander brings along with him or her an additional 2 copies of 3 more cards for a grand total of 20 cards in your tactics deck. The Targaryen faction, pictured here, is a bit unique in that each of their commanders brings 4 unique cards rather than 3, but one of those cards replaces a different card in the base deck. Each commander's set of tactics cards gives a unique flair to the base deck, shaking up the faction's playstyle or doubling down on what makes it strong. For the sake of keeping things high level and manageable, this video will only focus on the faction base deck rather than each individual commander's tactics cards. Part 3 in this series will branch out and cover each of the Brotherhood and Bolton commanders' tactics decks, however, since those are mini factions with fewer commanders. For this review, I've broken down tactics card identity into a set of 6 characteristics: control, damage, healing, movement, protection, and tokens. Some tactics cards will only have one of these characteristics, while others may have several. At the end of each faction review, I will tally up the total number of each characteristic found in the deck, and then show what the overall identity looks like, and summarize some pros and cons of each deck. This should give folks a good high-level idea of how each faction plays and what to expect when playing them. Some cards will also have a conditional banner on them to show that they are either highly situational in their use or that they require some condition to be met before the card does anything. I'll provide a conditionality rating for each deck in the faction review as well. Now I'll very quickly run through the card characteristics. I explained these in some detail in part 1 of the series, so I'll just flip through them quickly here. First up is control. There's hard control and soft control. There's a couple of examples of control cards here. Next, there's damage. This is anything that really gives free attacks or that affects panic tests. Some other things as well. Healing is pretty self-explanatory, restoring wounds or transferring models between units. Movement, also pretty self-explanatory, gives you free moves, shifts, increases movement speed. Protection is a bit of a larger category. Lots of different types of protection. Panic, defense rerolls, token removal, some other things. And then token generation, also pretty self-explanatory, either a token generating effect or some kind of token conversion effect. Now we'll get on to our first of the 4 factions, House Martell. I'll just say up front that I play 3 out of the 4 factions in this video, and I absolutely despise playing against the other faction. I'll leave it to you to figure out which is which, although I doubt it'll be all that much of a challenge. Now let's get on to the detestable Martell faction. Now, House Martell has a very kind of Eastern-focused aesthetic going, very much kind of like a Middle Eastern, also a little bit of maybe an Iberian influence in some things. And the deck and overall vibe is very much kind of desert-focused, I would say. And you'll see how that kind of theme kind of runs through the actual tactics deck and the play style of the faction as we go along. Now here are the first 3 cards. You'll see there's a couple of control cards here, and then in the middle there's Unbowed, Unbent, Unbroken. This is a very strong card in that it allows you to re-roll panic test dice or just pass it if you control the swords. And any card that gives you another crack at re-rolling panic test dice or a mechanic to auto pass is extremely strong. And this one not only gives you that, but then afterwards you can attach this card to an enemy unit, and they suffer a -2 to their morale test rolls until they're targeted by the swords. So that's another thing you're going to notice a lot in the Martell faction. There's lots of things that are kind of debuffs on your opponent's units. Now the next set of 3 cards here, you see one conditional card, Roynish Vengeance. That's kind of Martell's quest card, except this one goes on an enemy unit, not on one of your units. So it goes on an enemy unit, and then when one of your friendly units is destroyed, that enemy unit will suffer wounds. They suffer wounds whenever that unit rolls a 1 on attack dice, kind of like a Reckless Strikes ability, which can get really nasty if this unit is weakened too. And then they'll also take wounds when that unit is targeted by the tactic zone, zones. So if you as the Martell player control the crowns, that is. So this one can get really nasty and can really do a lot of damage and kind of influence your opponent's behavior. And then there's a couple of token generating cards here, and then a little bit more protection and some movement. Now here is what I consider to be the best card in the deck, at least from my standpoint. On the receiving end, it is the most annoying card to get. This always seems to be slapped on one of my combat units right when they're about to do a coup de grace on one of my opponent's units or do something really cool that I had been thinking about doing all game. I get slapped with this card, and then all of a sudden, they just sit there and hit like a limp noodle. So rising temperatures, it can really massively debuff your opponent's unit. And I've also tagged it with a protection tag here also because it does kind of indirectly reduce the amount of damage you're taking. So if an enemy's really high powered, highly aggressive unit is about to attack you and you hit them with this, then that enemy now can't play their attack modifying cards on that unit. That unit goes from perhaps a 3+ to hit to a 4+ to hit. So you're likely to not be taking as many wounds from that unit. So that's why I put a P tag on this one here, because it's kind of passive protection. All right, now here's the Tactics deck roll up. It has a pretty average conditionality of 14%. That's just pretty much what any deck gets that has kind of one quest card as the conditional card. And you'll notice here there's a high degree of control in the Martell deck. And as you saw from the cards, the control isn't so much in the form of like what you see in the Lannisters, where it's counterplot telling you you can't play that card, or intrigue and subterfuge telling you no, that NCU you have is not going to be doing anything cool this round. The Martell control is really that soft control, like I had in the characteristic description. Martell control will tell you that you can still do what you want to do, and they're not going to stop you. But if you do that thing you want to do, it's probably going to hurt you. So go ahead and do that attack. Go ahead and play that NCU, but there's going to be consequences. So Martell control is soft control, but it is nonetheless very powerful control. And in their tactics deck, there's really not much damage to speak of. The only damage is the Roynish Vengeance card. Also not too much movement, surprisingly, but the Martell units themselves are very highly mobile. What you do get, though, is some protection, partly in some of those debuffs, and then a ton of token gen. A lot of their token gen, though, is based on which zones you control, but Martells are really kind of infamous for being able to throw a lot of tokens out. Now for pros, they do have a lot of soft control, like I just mentioned, and the passive protection of kind of wearing down your opponent's units. They do have the auto pass panic test card in the unbowed, unbent, unbroken, and lots of token gen. Now for cons, no healing cards in the base deck, no attack or damage supporting cards. They give you extra keywords, and then those token gen effects are dependent on zone control or your opponent's making a certain choice that you gave him with one of those control cards. Now, for the Martell identity, it really reminds me of this scene from the movie Kingdom of Heaven, where you have these kind of dehydrated, exhausted, bedraggled masses of knights kind of wandering through the desert trying to find the Saracen army. They're just worn down. They always feel like they're maybe that they're almost in the battle. That the enemy is just ahead of them a little bit, but they just keep getting dragged in deeper into the desert and worn down. Meanwhile, the Martell player is just kind of, playing around and biding their time and just waiting for the right moment to strike. And that's really how the tactics deck feels. And playing against them, you definitely do feel like those knights wandering dehydrated and exhausted through the desert. So the Martells have a lot of soft control to wear the opponent down, confound their actions, and make you literally pick your poison. And their combat units are lightly armored but hard hitting. And really, the Martell's best defense isn't their defense stats so much as it is their ability to weaken their opponents and wear them down. And like I say here, there is this real true feeling of the oppression of the desert and of this unseen, unreachable foe when you're playing against Martells. And I hate them intensely. Now, moving on to House Greyjoy. So the Greyjoys were my first faction in this game. I picked up the game originally right around the time the Greyjoys came out, and I was lured to the game by the Greyjoy sculpts and what I thought would be their play style. And visually, they're very much kind of Viking-esque. All their units are very they're not kind of prim and proper and shiny. They're all kind of rusty and dirty, and they're all just about attacking things and killing things and not necessarily looking fabulous while doing it. Now, looking at their first set of cards here, there's a bit of a mix of healing and damage, and that's going to be a theme running through the whole faction. They do have what is similar to an Assault Orders in their base deck. And if you remember the first video, I talked about how powerful Assault Orders is, especially having it in your base deck with the Starks. And Greyjoy has something similar here. They have We Do Not Sow. So it is a friendly unit performs a attack action, and then if you control, or if the opponent controls the bag, then you get to restore some wounds. So it's perhaps not as powerful as Assault Orders, although this does say one attack action, not a melee attack action, so you could take a ranged attack. But Assault Orders lets you charge, and a charge is a very powerful type of attack. And then What Is Dead May Never Die is another kind of signature Greyjoy card, and this one can heal one of your units. It can also, I put a protection tag on it because it can also prevent one of your units from being destroyed. So when one of your units would be destroyed, you just slap this one down, and instead of dying, it remains in play with 1 wound. And if that was the end of the attack, being a Greyjoy player, you could very easily find a couple of ways to probably heal that unit from 1 wound back up to 5, 6 wounds without too much effort. So What Is Dead May Never Die is like the bane of Greyjoy's opponent's existence, or one of the banes, I would say. And then Kraken's Wrath is a card that it has some zone dependencies, so that's why I gave it conditional, because it's kind of requires certain zones, but generally you're going to get something out of this card because one of those zones at least has been taken either by you or by the opponent when you play this card. But this kind of amps up your unit to do some extra damage or hand out tokens before doing some damage. Then the next 3 cards here, very healing heavy. So Blessed with Stone, Blessed with Steel. This one's conditional because you have to be engaged with someone to really get the most out of this card. Raiding Call is a wound transferring ability similar to like a Regroup and Reform or a Supply Aid, but it also allows you to move pillage around. And the Iron Price is a healing and a damage card because it allows you to restore some wounds, or also attack something more effectively than you would have been able to otherwise. And then for the best card in the deck, I've chosen Finger Dance, and this card's gone through a lot of changes since the original version. But this card, you attach it to one of your units until the end of the game, and it just pretty much gives them a buff for the rest of the game, where they essentially become they kind of get like the Red Priestess ability from the Baratheon faction, where you can just suffer a couple of wounds and then hand out panic tokens on demand to an enemy you're about to attack, or get rerolls. So you could take a few wounds, or take a couple of wounds, and then get some very beneficial pre-attack effects. And since these happen right before you attack, you could kind of get them in there at a point when the opponent may not be able to clear them off. So usually tokens are kind of slung around, and your opponent might have an ability to react to it, but so a lot of times your opponent won't be able to remove a token immediately. They might have to do it in their own turn or take a zone to remove a token. So this allows you to kind of throw tokens on an enemy right before punching them in the face, which is quite powerful. Now, looking at the Tactics deck roll-up, no surprises here if you're paying attention to the review of the cards. The deck is very focused on damage and healing, so really no control at all. The Greyjoys don't have any time for that funny business. No movement really, protection also lacking other than what is dead may never die. And just a little bit of token gen, not too much. The Greyjoy deck is definitely focused on smashing things in the face and then kind of having this supernatural amount of healing after they get punched in the face themselves. Deck conditionality is a little higher than average, but still kind of within acceptable range. Now for the pros, massive amount of healing effects, a lot of good damage boosting cards. The free attack card, We Do Not Sow, also good because it gives Greyjoy players, it gives you, no matter which commander you're taking, gives you free attacks. And I'm putting an NCU mention in here because I didn't really have any place else to put it, but I think it is important to the faction to mention that the Balon Greyjoy non-combat unit allows you to respawn a dead unit. So if one of your units dies, even if it's like your best unit, you have at your disposal an effect from one of your non-combat units to just raise them from the dead and bring them back onto the battlefield, which is pretty insane. And all Greyjoy units get have a pillage mechanic that makes them grow stronger as they kill things. I won't go into details on the pillage mechanic, but if you're interested in the Greyjoys and don't know about it, you can do a little bit more research and find out, or look at some of the unit cards. Now, moving on to the cons. They have no movement cards and very little protection. And their durability comes from reactive healing and the cheat death card and the resurrection ability from the NCU. And you might say they're a little bit more one-dimensional than other armies, but I would say they're just very focused on what they do well. And if you like punching stuff in the face and then just hoping you can heal back enough wounds to stay in the game, then the Greyjoys are for you. And I'd say their healing abilities have really only improved as time has gone on and updates have come and gone. So they still feel very, very tough, even though they don't have a lot of other protective abilities. And they are an all-infantry army, so they don't have any cavalry option inside of their faction. So if you wanted to take a cavalry unit, you'd have to go get a neutral one. But they do have a good number of high movement speed units, so you don't have to worry too much about being super slow. As for identity, they're a faction of hard-hitting Viking-esque raiders with an almost undead level of healing and resurrection. I've heard them referred to as the undead faction of A Song of Ice and Fire for a very long time. And Greyjoy units, they get stronger as they accumulate pillage, so they might start off the game at a little bit lower power level than their opponent, but Greyjoys do have ways to get pillage immediately, pretty much, with some various other mechanics. The Greyjoys can heal back very quickly from almost being killed, and they can even cheat death and come back from the dead. So if any of these things appeal to you, then Greyjoys might be for you. Now, moving on to House Targaryen. So House Targaryen, the starter box is all focused on cavalry, but the faction itself is very diverse in the units that it can take. Now, let's look at the tactics deck of the Targaryens. You will see some of that cavalry DNA running through it, though, as we go along. Looking at the first three cards, we have Fire and Blood. It's a damage card, gives you some extra attack abilities. Sudden Retreat, it's a good movement and protection card, because I do consider retreats to fall under the movement category as well as protection category. And Swift Reposition, kind of a classic movement card. Shift 2 inches or perform a 3-inch maneuver, depending on zone control. And the second set of cards, There's your quest card, Blood of the Dragon, so I've hit it with the conditional tag. It's a damage and protection ability because you can get +1 attack die or suffer fewer wounds from failing panic tests. Unstoppable Advance has a few tags on it. It's a damage card because it allows you to reroll charge distance dice, or if you use the other ability of it, you can get additional movement speed when maneuvering during a Surge Fourth, and then weaken opponents around you. Now, I could easily put a conditional on this one because of the Surge Fourth ability on the bottom, but since it does have a charge reroll, I would consider that not super conditional because you're going to be charging more often than surging forth. So this one just kind of squeaked away with not being conditional. And then Field Control, this is a movement and token generating card that is dependent on when any NCU claims the horse, which also isn't too conditional because that's going to happen pretty much every round. So you can get something out of this card. And then moving on to the best card of the deck, in my opinion, it's Overrun. I put a conditional tag on it here because it's only useful for a Surge Fourth, which may not necessarily happen every round, so you may be holding onto this card or ditching it. But instead of a Surge Fourth, you can do a charge or a march action, which, depending on the army you're running, this can be extremely powerful. You can have a Khal Drogo list where you charge into something, finish it off, throw down an overrun, surge forth to charge into something, and just kind of ping pong around and do a whole bunch of damage. So this card can be quite useful. Also, if you're playing with dragons and you have this card in your deck, you can roast something and then overrun into something else and roast it. So things can get kind of crazy with this card. And yeah, it's my favorite card. Looking at the tactics deck roll up, you see it's very damage and mobility focused here. So you have some damage and attack supporting abilities, and then a whole bunch of movement cards. A little bit of protection, a little bit of token gen, but some of the token gen is pretty conditional. And a deck conditionality of 29%, so fairly benign amount of conditionality. Now moving on to the pros and cons. Pros, so there's a ton of movement cards. It supports a cavalry focused army like you get in the starter box. And the damage cards help charges to succeed, deliver harder hits. And there are some complementary card triggers. So if you have the right cards in your hand, you can use a card to reroll a charge, then slap down a card to make your attack hit harder, and then slap down an overrun if you kill that thing to go into something else. So there is the ability to chain some cards together here with the card triggers. Now the cons, the movement focus deck doesn't really complement the infantry units in the faction as well as it does the cavalry units. So you have all these cool infantry units in the faction, but the deck doesn't do a whole lot for them. It's been changed in recent patches to support them a bit more, but it still feels very much like a cavalry-centered faction. There's no healing in the deck and little protection. This has kind of been the identity of the faction forever, really. Healing has always been at a premium in this faction. It's more about kind of killing things, maneuvering around, staying out of a fair fight. And then the token gen cards are situational and conditional. Looking at the identity, so there's a very diverse set of combat and non-combat units in this faction. If anybody's seen the TV show or read the books, you know Daenerys' journey from the beginning to where the books lead off or where the show ends. She encounters all kinds of different peoples and characters, and in this game she brings a lot of those folks along with her. So everything from lions to dragons and freed slaves, and the army is very lightly armored, but it does have good morale. And right now it's best when led by Khal Drogo and a cavalry army, but a Daenerys Mother of Dragons list is kind of making some waves in the faction right now. So the dragon focused list is pretty viable right now. There are Unsullied in the faction, and they're some of my favorite units, but they still feel like they're a little bit less than well supported, I would say. So they're still fun and they are still solid, but it just feels like they're kind of infantry in a cavalry faction still. Now moving on to our last faction of the video, House Baratheon. So House Baratheon, aesthetically, they're kind of your typical heavily armored knights. You know, you've got this almost like French chivalric vibe going through them, at least on the Renly side of the faction. So the faction's split in two between Stannis and Renly. We'll maybe touch on that a little bit in a moment. But moving on to their cards, here's their 7 cards at a glance. And then moving on to the first set of 3, we've got a couple of token cards, a little bit of protection, and a damage card here. So Baratheon Justice allows you to throw out a bunch of tokens after you're attacked. Stag's Wit is quite a good card in that it allows you kind of on-demand token removal, and then you can take that token and throw it back in your opponent's face. Ours is the Fury is a very good attack card, but it is zone dependent. But it does offer some very good buffs to your unit before they attack. Moving on to the next one, Oath of Duty is Baratheon's quest card, so I've thrown on the conditional banner onto it, but it offers some damage and token support there. Baratheon Conviction is both a damage, healing, and token card, so when you pass a morale test, you heal 2 wounds. There's the healing tag. And if you control the crown, all enemies you're engaged with suffer a panic test, so that's potential damage there. And then if you control the letter or the tactics zone, then you can throw a condition token out. And then Sustained Assault, also a damage card. And then moving on to the best card, which is a surprise to no one who's ever played as Baratheon or against Baratheon, is Final Strike. It is the stuff of nightmares for the Baratheon's opponents. This card is kind of the apex retribution card, really. So Baratheon has a very retributive streak running through the faction, and this is kind of that style to a T. So when you're attacked by a unit, let's say you take a brutal attack and you go from 12 models down to 2 models, you could throw this card down and then throw 10 hits back in your opponent's face, potentially killing them. So I've given this one a control and a damage tag. The damage tag is obvious, but the control is because this is kind of a soft control card, because your opponent always has to wonder if you have this in your hand, and if they've played Baratheon against Baratheon before, they know you might have this in your hand. So if they might be a little bit hesitant to attack you with a unit that could potentially end up killing itself. You know, so if they attack you with a unit with 4, 5, 6 wounds and they do a surprisingly successful attack against you, they might be worried that they're going to accidentally just kill themselves with this card. So it does get in your opponent's head a little bit and maybe does a little behavior modification on them. So that's why I've given it a control tag. Now for the tactics deck roll up, you see a pretty high amount of damage and token gen. So not a whole lot of control, healing, protection, no movement to speak of at all. So this deck is very damage and token centric, and it's all very, like, for the most part, the tokens are pretty reactive. And the conditionality 14%. And moving into the pros, so there's a good set of signature damage cards with Ours is the Fury, Final Strike, Sustained Assault, lots of retribution style effects, and then a decent amount of token gen. The token removal card, Stag's Wit, is really great. And also a pro, the faction is split by loyalty, so there's Stannis and Renly loyalty, so there's units in the faction that are distinct for those 2 loyalties. Stannis is very kind of heavier armed, a little bit of panic focus. Renly is more lightly armed. I think I'll talk about this in a minute. But moving on to the cons, so there's 2 attack supporting cards that share a trigger, so they can't be used at the same time, which is unfortunate. And Baratheon Justice and Final Strike also share the same trigger, so there's a little bit of stream crossing here on the triggers. And there's no movement cards, and this is a very slow faction for the most part, except for maybe the Renly side, but a lot of their units in this faction are pretty slow, so having no movement cards hurts them a little bit in the movement arena. and there's not a whole lot of healing or protection from the deck. And another con, the faction is split by loyalty. So for identity, it's a split loyalty faction, so it leads to multiple playstyles, really, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's pretty cool, personally, that you can almost get two completely different playstyles out of one faction. Renly is a more lightly armored, fast, and healing-focused sub-faction, so their commanders do have more healing, and they are more sprightly. Stannis is more heavily armored, slow, grindy, with some panic shenanigans. And overall, the faction is very it's focused on more like proactive protection by being either more maneuverable in the case of Renly or just more tanky in the case of Stannis. And once they're attacked, Baratheon armies have lots of ways to just take vengeance on the attacker, which is pretty cool. All right, well, that does it for part 2 in our A Song of Ice and Fire Faction Identity Review series. I hope new and veteran players got something out of this video, and if you haven't watched part 1 in the series, go check that one out. I'll leave a link to that video in the end titles and in the description. I hope you'll all join me again soon as we wrap up the series with part 3 covering House Bolton and the Brotherhood Without Banners. I'd be very interested to hear feedback from you all about what you thought about these factions and if my analysis on them was on point. Were there any surprising revelations about the faction identities in this video, or was this just about what you expected to see? Thanks very much for joining me, and please don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel to stay informed of future video releases. Until next time, this is Randall, signing off.